I'm going to talk today about energy and climate. And that might seem a bit surprising because my full-time work at the Foundation is mostly about vaccines and seeds, about the things that we need to invent and deliver to help the poorest 2 billion live better lives. But energy and climate are extremely important to these people. In fact, more important than to anyone else on the planet. The climate getting worse means that many years their crops won't grow. There'll be too much rain, not enough rain. Things will change in ways that their fragile environment simply can't support. And that leads to starvation, it leads to uncertainty, it leads to unrest. So the climate changes will be terrible for them. CO2 is warming the planet. And the equation on CO2 is actually a very straightforward one. If you sum up the CO2 that gets emitted, that leads to a temperature increase. And that temperature increase leads to some very negative effects. The effects on the weather, perhaps worse, the indirect effects in that the natural ecosystems can't adjust to these rapid changes, and so you get ecosystem collapses. Now, we put out a lot of carbon dioxide every year, over 26 billion tons. For each American, it's about 20 tons. For people in poor countries, it's less than 1 ton. It's an average about 5 tons for everyone on the planet. And somehow we have to make changes that will bring that down to zero. It's been constantly going up. It's only various economic changes that have even flattened it at all. So we have to go from rapidly rising to falling and falling all the way to zero. This equation has 4 factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra. But let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. But there we see an increase of about 1.3. I thought back to a year ago when I brought mosquitoes, and somehow people enjoyed that. It really got them involved in the idea of, there are people who live with mosquitoes. So with energy, all I could come up with is this. I decided that releasing fireflies would be my contribution to the environment here this year. So here we have some natural fireflies. I'm told they don't bite. In fact, they might even not even leave that jar. Now, there's all sorts of gimmicky solutions like that one, but they don't really add up to much. We need solutions, either one or several, that have unbelievable scale and unbelievable reliability. And although there's many directions that people seeking, I really only see 5 that can achieve the big numbers. I've left out tide, geothermal, fusion, biofuels. Those may make some contribution, and if they can do better than I expect, so much the better. But my key point here is that we're going to have to work on each of these 5, and we can't give up any of them because they look daunting, because they all have significant challenges. There's a lot that has to come together. So this is a wish. It's a very concrete wish that we invent this technology. If you gave me only one wish for the next 50 years, I can pick who's president, I can pick a vaccine, which is something I love, or I could pick that this thing that's half the cost with no CO2 gets invented. This is the wish I would pick. This is the one with the greatest impact. If we don't get this wish, the division between the people who think short-term and long-term will be terrible, between the US and China, between poor countries and rich, and most of all, the lives of those 2 billion will be far worse.
Well, now, this is a story of an amazingly beautiful young woman. She was training to be a pro football cheerleader, and she got a flu shot. She says that shot has destroyed her chances of happiness. We told you about her story last time. Now, Les Trent is with this woman for a first-hand look at what her life has become.
Right. She's the beautiful cheerleader whose heartbreaking story is shocking the nation. 25-year-old Desiree Jennings showed me how she can't walk without twisting, jerky movements. But she walks backwards normally. Doctors say she has a rare 1 in a million neurological disorder that was triggered 10 days after she got a seasonal flu shot.
Started with me not being able to eat without passing out.
You couldn't eat without passing out?
I visited Desiree and her husband Brendan at their home in Ashburn, Virginia to see what their daily life is like. She has to go up and down stairs backwards because something as simple as walking forward can be dangerous.
And here's the unusual part about the disorder. Take a look at this. Desiree can run just fine. It's only when she stops. You see, that's where the spasms start. Now, you can walk backwards, though, and it'll make it better, right?
Yeah.
She runs with a normal stride, and as I ran with her, she even spoke normally.
And now you can talk.
Yeah, it's weird. It fixes as soon as I start running.
I mean, you sound...
I know, it's great, isn't it?
You sound amazing. And then you stop, and that's what happens.
Desiree got a flu shot on August 23rd. 10 days later, she came down with what doctors have diagnosed as dystonia, a rare neurological disorder. Her jerking and twisting are the result of uncontrollable muscle contractions. There is no known cure.
Are y'all ready?
Yes.
This is home video of Desiree as a beautiful bride when she married Brendan 2 years ago. And this is a photo when she was training to be a cheerleader for the Washington Redskins. Doctors say what happened to Desiree should discourage people from getting flu shots. But here's what the woman who's on the wrong side of being 1 in a million says.
Running has to be a relief.
The only thing I have left.
The only thing you have left.
The NIH, we were more concerned on what are we doing to get thimerosal out of vaccines. That was our focus as a committee. What have we done? What is the level of evidence? We wanted to have Congressman Burton wrote Secretary Shalala and asked her to recall all thimerosal-containing vaccines that infants were exposed to, and she refused. They said that if they issued a recall, that the industry would sue the FDA, and therefore they would not do that.
When you look at the Simpsonwood Conference in Norcross, Georgia, which included leaders from the WHO, the FDA, the CDC, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and leading scientists, they looked at data from the Vaccine Safety Data Link that directly showed a link between the development of neurodevelopmental disorders and the administration of mercury-containing vaccines.
Somebody provided me with the Simpsonwood memo. Simpsonwood was a transcript of a secret meeting that was held between CDC and representatives of the vaccine industry, in which they reviewed a report that CDC had ordered, the Verstraeten study, of the 100,000 children in the United States Vaccine Safety Database.
There was clear evidence between the injection of children with mercury-containing vaccines and the development of neurodevelopmental disorders in children.
Which they are talking about the undeniability of the connection between autism and thimerosal, the impossibility of massaging the data further in order to try to eliminate those signals. That's what they spend the first 2 hours. The rest of the meeting they spend talking about how do we hide this from the press, from the public, and what they call the predatory bar.
The participants were told that the information was embargoed, that they were not allowed to discuss this with the public. And there was no question, if you look at the comments, that they knew this information would have a significant impact on the vaccine program, both domestically and worldwide. And one of the participants said, until we get this straightened out, I do not want my grandson to have thimerosal in their vaccines.
And these data were covered up. the data from this conference was specifically kept from the public because the scientists and the leaders who were at that conference knew that if this information got out to the public, it would stop the vaccine program in its track.
And then over a period of years, they processed the data, they excluded some populations. There are a lot of things that you can do with a large sample epidemiology study. And over time, with each successive iteration, they made that signal smaller and smaller, so that by the time they published the findings, they said, well, geez, there's a little bit of a signal here, but it's probably just random chance.
That's fraud. It is fraud in science, and there are federal laws against that, and there are certainly ethical laws against that in the world of science. And the Simpson-Wood showed that the doctors involved, the scientists involved in this community, were more worried about preserving the policies of immunization, of protecting the industry, than they were about whether or not children were being harmed. And that, to me, is an abomination. You know, we have a public health system that is supposed to protect the public. And what we found is they were more protecting their own policies, and they were all worried about making sure that they were not going to be found at fault.
We saw what they saw at the very beginning. We saw what they published at the end. And that gap is what makes many of us so upset, because it looks to us like they were tampering with the evidence, and that they had it, they knew it, and they ended up publishing a conclusion that hid the real data, and that's a real shame. This was a moment where the government could have come clean, that the government could have immediately recalled all vaccine with thimerosal in it. They could have taken proactive steps, and by covering this up, not only were they hiding the truth, but they were allowing affected children to go untreated and for more children to be affected.
My name is Barbara Lowe Fisher, and this is a vaccine commentary brought to you by the National Vaccine Information Center. Today I want to talk about swine flu. A group of drug companies $1 billion to fast-track experimental swine flu vaccines that may include whole live or killed or genetically engineered human and animal viruses. Every pharmaceutical drug, including vaccines, carries a risk, and those risks are greater for some than others. In this time of fear, we can't let that fear take away our freedom to make voluntary health decisions. The human right to informed consent to medical risk-taking gives citizens the power to make sure that the cure is not more dangerous than the disease. Thank you.
I wrote a letter last week talking about the work at the foundation, sharing some of the problems, and Warren Buffett had recommended I do that, being honest about what was going well, what wasn't, and making it kind of an annual thing. A goal I had there was to draw more people in to work on those problems, because I think there are some very important problems that don't get worked on naturally. That is, the market does not drive the scientists, the communicators, the thinkers, the governments to do the right things. And only by paying attention to these things and having brilliant people who care and draw other people in can we make as much progress as we need to. So this morning I'm going to share two of these problems and talk about where they stand. Why? Well, there's only a few diseases that account for the vast majority of those deaths. Diarrhea, pneumonia, and malaria. And so that brings us to the first problem that I'll raise this morning, which is how do we stop a disease, a deadly disease, that's spread by mosquitoes? Well, what's the history of this disease? It's been a severe disease for thousands of years. In fact, if we look at the genetic code, it's the only disease we can see that people who lived in Africa actually evolved several things to avoid malarial deaths. Terrible disease. It was in the United States. It was in Europe. People didn't know what caused it until the early 1900s when a British military man figured out that it was mosquitoes. Now, malaria is, of course, transmitted by mosquitoes. I brought some here so you could experience this. We'll let those roam around the auditorium a little bit. There. There's no reason only poor people should have the experience.
So horrifying, and I know it's hard for people to be able to admit this to themselves, but if you'll just go research the facts, it's all there. And the good news is record numbers of people are refusing to take the vaccines, and record numbers of people are reading the literature and finding out how deadly this is, and government after government after government, from England to Australia, from Finland to India, is having to totally suspend or restrict giving these shots because people now understand how dangerous it is because there's such a wide swath of death and destruction in its wake. We're starting to win. We're starting to have an effect. And that's why the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has given money to Monsanto and others to come up with pharmacological crops that grow the vaccines inside of the food so there's no way for you to escape it. That's why Bill Gates is looking at releasing genetically engineered mosquitoes to, quote, inoculate you.
There's new drug discovery going on. Our foundation is backed a vaccine that's going into phase 3 trial that starts in a couple months.
Literally releasing bugs that come out and inject you with these things. They're not playing games. They want to force you to go under this eugenics system. Every time the global elite meet and they set up these philanthropic organizations, all they talk about is population control. This is what they're obsessed with. They don't like going to the Grand Canyon and seeing big crowds. They want all the science and technology for themselves, not for the general population. It's the ultimate form of greed and envy and control. It's a scorched earth policy of total monopoly over humanity. You are being slowly killed. Cancers are off the charts. Every other form of degenerative disease is off the charts. And they know that the vaccines, the sodium fluoride, the bisphenol A, and all of these chemicals are doing it. And we have their own documents admitting it.
What we need to do is show parents that very important information has been covered up.
I just want to start by asking the CDC one question. How stupid do you think we are? I made a movie about two dumb guys, but nobody's this stupid.
Turn around and face the media, please, and I'll join you, and show them and show the world the reason we're here today. These children are trying so hard to show us how to live in a cleaner world. These kids are here for a reason, to teach us to eat better, clean up the air, get rid of toxins, because they can't survive. I know, I really do know that this is their main purpose, and I pray that we all start to wake up and collectively change this world into the new world our kids are working so hard to create.
Oftentimes they will avoid the obvious cause of a problem if the solution is inconvenient. And I certainly wouldn't trust the drug companies to regulate themselves.
I read these studies, and I saw studies that weren't even good for it. Wasn't even high-quality fraud. You see the press here and all there, not a single member of this press corps, I can guarantee you, has ever read any of those studies. It has not happened. What they read was the CDC's description of those studies, which has nothing to do with what's in the studies. And ultimately, the American press has completely let down our democracy.
We have, as a nation, gotten used to quick sound bites. We have 24-hour news on 24 stations. So they go to organizations that put together the news stories for them. The NIH on its website, and most government agencies now on their websites, have prepackaged stories put together. The industry does the same thing. The pharmaceutical industry puts together stories for the industry to run so that any of the networks can pick up a story on immunization that's been put together by the people who have a specific opinion. And reporters are simply being lazy. They're not doing their job. They're taking for granted that somebody from the government's being honest with them. And how many times have we seen somebody from the government have an opinion or a position that turned out to be wrong?
Talk current affairs. Talk celebrity affairs. Talk pleasure this weekend. Talk plans for vacation. Talk saving your money. Help saving the environment. Get more information from all your pump stations at the new msn.ca.
There's new drug discovery going on. Our foundation is backed a vaccine that's going into phase 3 trial that starts in a couple months.
Warn everyone you know. Send them the vaccine inserts. They're online, where it says it can cause cancer, where it says it can cause neurological disorders, where it admits that it's even caused deaths. Send them all the mainstream news articles that we're going to link below, where major governments are having to suspend the shots because it's causing so much carnage. Warn everyone you know. This is incredibly serious. Bayer Pharmaceutical admitted in court that for over a decade they knowingly sent out factor VIII blood product to hemophiliacs, knowing it was a death sentence of hepatitis and HIV. They did it cold-bloodedly as part of a eugenics program. The crimes of Big Pharma are legion, and they need to be prosecuted. They need to be brought to justice, but there's a revolving door between Big Pharma, GMO, and the government. Almost every major federal regulator, not just here, but in every other major country, is a former alumni of these companies who own stock. And then they leave the government and go back into those companies and move up that ladder of power for selling out their fellow humans. This is part of the eugenics agenda. Yeah, I never got the flu till I took the flu shot. It almost killed me. Same thing happened to my mother. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the United Nations documents, we have the Rockefeller Foundation documents from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and right through, admitting they developed vaccines for flu or tetanus, where they add chemicals and hormones that reduce your fertility or sterilize you.
30 years ago, I was involved in a serious investigation of vaccines, and I called various media people, including the New York Times, with evidence that there was a serious vaccine regulation problem in the United States. And the guy from the New York Times said, I've looked into my files and I don't see any stories saying there's a serious regulatory problem. So as far as I'm concerned, there's no serious regulatory problem. We kept working away and we had a lot of help from people inside the government and ended up with hearings by Senator Ribicoff that caused the agency at NIH that regulated vaccines to be closed down, caused the Attorney General to rule that it had been violating the Food and Drug Law for the past 30 years, that was 30 years ago, caused a situation in which it laid the groundwork for proving that the swine flu vaccine was in fact unsafe, ineffective, and in my opinion a fraud. All of that was done in spite of the fact that the press systematically said, we don't see any problem in vaccines. The very thing they're saying now.
There was a recent study in 2008 looking at the relationship between children who had gastrointestinal symptoms and autism, and those children who just had gastrointestinal symptoms, to identify whether or not the measles vaccine was related to their development of autism. And this was a very small sample size. 25 of the children were in the study group, 13 were in the control group. They made it out to be that this study was definitive evidence that there is no link between vaccines and autism. Now, anyone who knows anything about statistics and studies knows that 38 children is not a sufficient number of children to study to make any definitive conclusions about. And you also have to look at who did the study, and those bits of information don't come out into the public. Unfortunately, what happens is pediatricians and family docs hear the literature and take it as gospel, and then start reporting to parents all over the place that indeed there are no worries about the relationship between the development of autism and the administration of vaccines. But the docs aren't looking at the studies. And unfortunately, what happens in our society is if there's a select group that makes something a truth, and enough people hear about it, then a lot of people are going to believe that it's true without actually investigating for themselves.
The argument that these ideas about vaccines are based on science is actually not a sound argument. Most of the research that's done on vaccines is paid for by people who are either manufacturing or selling vaccines. These people are biased in what they do.
All of the safety studies done on vaccines are done by the companies that manufacture the vaccines. The approval of the safety and the approval of the administration of these vaccines is most often done by the employees of the vaccine manufacturers as well. This is a huge conflict of interest. If we want to understand whether these vaccines are safe, we need to have independent researchers looking at these studies and doing them without the financial and the medical interests that are influencing the decision making.
The American Academy of Pediatrics is the union of pediatricians. And one of the things I think you learn about unions is that their job is to advocate for the livelihood of their members. And I think pediatricians are by and large wonderful people. They get into the business of pediatrics because they want to help children and make them healthier. It's a very difficult thing for most pediatricians to come to grips with the idea, even the suggestion, that their care of children may have caused more harm than good.
The CDC and the FDA and even the NIH continue to say there's no evidence of harm because they are only focusing on the epidemiological studies that the CDC funded. They are not looking at the studies out of MIT and out of Columbia, the studies that Dr. Haley has done. They have completely ignored the hard science, which to me is an absurd thing, because at the NIH in the 90s, when I was there, you only looked at the hard science. Epidemiology was something that was not given the high priority that is given today in this discussion.
This whole process is designed specifically to make a market for vaccines. And behind it all is Merck Sharp and Dohme as one of the major forces, Merck now, who's gotten hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government to create vaccine production, distribution, and collect billions of dollars in selling those products. No one who works for a company should be allowed to be on those committees. No one who works for an agency that distributes those vaccines should be allowed to be on those committees. And when the federal agencies are there, they should be counterbalanced by people who are in fact seriously concerned about vaccine safety.
People who are elected to office, who are selected to committees, are often given donations for their campaigns, are often given salaries by the companies that have a vested interest in policies and legislation being passed that mandates vaccines to our children. The public doesn't want to believe this, but we need to, because there is a conflict of interest, because many of the legislators and many of the scientists who are operating supposedly in our best interest are being given money, either in campaigns or in salaries, to support the continuation of the vaccine program.
We had a lot of conversation at the committee level with doctors who were doing research in vaccine injury.
This is really important, and I hope this can get out on the web as far as possible, as quickly as possible. I've been watching this for a while. If you do only one thing in the next few months that is to protect you and your family, then do this. Don't have the vaccine. Don't have the vaccine. Tell as many people as you can, don't have the vaccine. Get on the internet. Check it out. Go to my website. You'll see the charges that have been filed with the FBI against this group of people and organizations. This is the idea, because they want to dramatically reduce the number of people in the world, and they also want to access the body and therefore destabilize it mentally, emotionally, and physically. This is why we've had this explosion of vaccines for kids, to the point now where they're having 25 or more before the age of 2, yes, in America and Britain and elsewhere. And this is pouring total shite into a still emerging immune system. You've got a growing, developing immune system, and you're saying the first 2 years of life, have some of that, darling. We have an incredible defense system called the human immune system. And when that is strong and in optimal efficiency, it keeps us well. It gets rid of foreign attacks on the body. If you undermine the human immune system, or you stop it developing properly so it's undermined for life by throwing all this stuff at under twos, then you open people up to getting illnesses and being killed by things that the immune system in its true optimal state would deal with easily. There is a war on the human immune system, because when that goes down, we go down. Because we ain't going to live for long if that's not working properly. And they're targeting the kids from a very, very early age. And that's what this is all about, on one level. But on another level, this is about a colourful population. I'm not saying for a second that vast numbers of people will keel over overnight. That would be too bloody obvious. But the effects of this vaccine, as people move forward, is going to manifest itself in lots of different ways. It's more likely that there will be effects of many and various kinds, because the body is an electrochemical organism, and it has an optimum electrochemical balance, and we call that health. When you imbalance that through introducing chemicals and electromagnetic sources, then you move it from optimum, and it no longer works correctly, emotionally, mentally, or physically. And if you look at the cumulative chemical onslaught, particularly on children, but people in general, in food, drink, soft drinks, and mobile phones, and all that stuff on the electromagnetic side, humans are being bombarded. There's a war on our children's minds, there's a war on our children's immune systems, and there's a war on our children's emotional balance. And it's connected into all these different areas of food, of drink, and of vaccines, of pharmaceutical medicines. They invent diseases so that problem, or in this case, no problem, reaction, solution. Take this.
It's like the 1976 US swine flu. There was loads of scary adverts on TV.
Oh, yeah.
Betty went to the shop and she gave it to, and there was all that kind of stuff. And as it went on, the music got darker, the voice echoed. It was really, and then they showed people kind of playing golf and then shivering in bed.
This is it. The whole foundation of it is a mind game.
Yeah.
It's about the manipulation of our perception of everything, because our perception leads to our behavior and our actions. If you're going to control someone's actions, then you need to control their perception, because that controls their actions. And the perception they want people in more than anything is danger, danger, danger. Because once you get someone in fear of something, they will look outside of themselves for something or someone to protect them from what they've been manipulated to fear. So get them to fear swine flu, they will then say, save me from swine flu, okay, give us your arm.
Good night.
Right, give us your children's arm. Oh no, oh darling, you must be vaccinated, the swine flu's coming. Pathetic. What people have got to do, go on the internet and put in 1976 swine flu conspiracy or words to that effect, or go into YouTube and see the adverts they put out in 76 to frighten people into being vaccinated for an epidemic that did not happen, and the consequences of it. People died, people had their minds scrambled. It was, and they want to do that now on a massive scale. What they do, you see, is they have their version of trials. They've got a big version of something coming, but further down the line, or back down the line, they try it out. And what they're looking for is, will the public do it? Will the public stand for it? Will the public react the way we want?